making a case for one specific view, but it also does a great job laying out several others. Our mission for this deep dive, to unpack these different end timelines and, crucially, understand the core reasons and the biblical interpretations behind them. We'll be focusing particularly on the argument presented for the pre-tribulation view. Think of it like getting a good map to navigate this pretty complex prophetic landscape.
That's a good way to put it. These sources really explore how interpreting biblical prophecy, especially about that event where believers are caught up, the rapture can lead to, profoundly different ideas about when this happens, specifically when it happens relative to a future tribulation period and Christ's final return. What's really fascinating is how different starting points, different ways of reading Scripture shape the entire picture.
Okay, let's start right there then. Because you're right, at the heart of these differences is how various theological traditions read these prophetic texts. The source material makes it pretty clear. Approaches like, say, dispensational premillennialism, they tend towards a consistent literal interpretation. They often see very distinct plans for Israel and the church. Whereas other traditions like covenant theology or amillennialism, they might use more allegorical, maybe non-literal ways of reading prophecy. And this foundational difference really colors everything else.
Exactly. And it's based on those interpretive approaches that, several major theories about the rapture's timing have popped up. Our sources outline the main views within premillennialism, but they also give us perspective from postmillennial and amillennial folks, showing the broader spectrum.
Right. Before we zero in on the timing within a future tribulation, let's quickly touch on those broader frameworks you mentioned, postmillennialism and amillennialism. As our sources point out, these views generally don't teach a separate rapture event that's distinct from Christ's final second coming.
Correct. In postmillennialism, the core idea is that the world gradually gets Christianized before Christ returns. It ushers in a kind of golden age that's the millennium for them. So the rapture, in this view, isn't really a separate thing. It just happens as part of that single public second coming at the very end of the age.
And amillennialism, how does that differ?
Amillennialism interprets the millennium more symbolically. They see it as Christ's current spiritual reign happening right now during this church age. So for them, too, the rapture happens at the same single moment as Christ's return at the very end. And that's immediately followed by final judgment and the eternal state.
Okay.
So really, both of these historical views, they effectively see the catching up happening after the main events leading to the end, even if their view of the tribulation itself is different or maybe not literal.
Got it. So basically one main event at the culmination. Now let's pivot to the views that do focus on the rapture's timing relative to a future, often literal, 7-year tribulation. We should probably start with the ones where the church is present for some or maybe all of it.
Okay. The sources describe post-tribulational premillennialism, or post-trib for short. This view holds that the rapture and the second coming are essentially the same event. It happens at the very end of the 7-year tribulation. The core insight here is that the church is actually meant to endure the trials and persecution on earth during that time.
So they go through the whole thing.
Right. Believers meet Christ in the air when he returns visibly, publicly, and then they immediately come back down to earth with him. Key support often comes from Matthew 24, where Jesus talks about gathering the elect immediately after the tribulation.
Okay.
And they might also point to Christ's prayer in John 17. I don't ask, you take them out of the world, but keep them from the evil one. They see keeping as preservation through trials, not escape from them.
Interesting distinction. Okay, then there's mid-tribulational premillennialism, mid-trib.
Yeah.
As the name suggests, I guess this puts the rapture halfway through that 7-year period.
Exactly, right at the 3.5-year mark. The thinking is the church goes through the first half, maybe facing persecution, but gets taken out before the really horrific judgments of the second half, what some call the Great Tribulation.
And the support for that.
Well, proponents might connect the last trumpet in 1 Corinthians 15 with the 7th trumpet judgment in Revelation 11, for instance, or passages about 3.5 years of trouble.
Okay. Building on that, the pre-wrath rapture, how does that fit in?
Right, the pre-wrath view, this is a bit more nuanced, more recent refinement, really. It positions the rapture late in the tribulation, yes, but specifically before God's direct, divine wrath is poured out.
Ah, so there's a distinction in the type of suffering.
Precisely. They distinguish between tribulation caused by humans or Satan, which the church might experience, and the specific divine wrath of God, which they believe the church is promised exemption from.
Okay.
So the rapture, in this view, kind of cuts short the tribulation of the church, maybe mentioned in Matthew 24.22. It happens after certain cosmic signs like those in Matthew 24.29-31, which they often link to Revelation's sixth seal, but before the trumpet and bowl judgments, which they see as God's unique wrath.
That's a very specific timing.
Yeah.
And the source mentions one more, quite different one, the partial rapture theory.
Ah, yes, the partial rapture idea. This one's pretty different because it suggests the rapture happens maybe in stages, or only for believers who are, particularly watchful or spiritually ready.
So like a reward.
Almost, yeah. Framing it like a reward for faithful living. But our source notes this view is largely considered outside the mainstream.
Why is that?
Well, the main reason is the New Testament consistently talks about the church as one unified body. Passages describing the rapture, like 1 Corinthians 15 or 1 Thessalonians 4, they seem to depict all believers being changed or caught up together at the same time, not just a select few based on, how ready they are, their works. So yeah, it's presented as more of a fringe viewpoint in these sources.
Okay, that gives us a good map of the different theories. Now, the main paper we're looking at, it makes a really structured, detailed case for pre-tribulational premillennialism, the pre-trib view. This is the position that the rapture happens before the entire 7-year tribulation period even starts.
Right. And this view is what's a hallmark of dispensational premillennialism. It holds that Christ's return isn't just one single event, but it unfolds in 2 phases. First, he comes secretly for his church in the rapture, taking believers to heaven. And then later, he comes publicly with his church in glory. That's the second coming. Okay. The foundational idea is that the church has to be removed before that final 7-year prophetic period, Daniel's 70th week, begins. Because, as the source interprets it, that specific time is primarily about God's wrath and judgment focused on Israel and the unbelieving world, not the church.
So what are the main arguments, the biblical and theological pillars that support this view, according to the source? It lists several key lines of evidence.
Yeah, it does. One primary pillar is that emphasis on a consistent literal interpretation and the Israel church distinction.
We touched on that earlier.
Exactly. This approach reads prophecy literally, which leads them to conclude that Israel still has a specific future role in God's plan, distinct from his plan for the church. The church age, in this view, is seen almost like a parenthesis, you could say, or an intercalation is a term sometimes used. It's a period inserted into God's program that's mainly focused on Israel. So the logic is, for God's focus to return fully to Israel during the tribulation, which Jeremiah calls the time of Jacob's trouble, then the church, this distinct entity, has to be removed first via the rapture. That ends the parenthesis, allowing the original program to resume.
That distinction is certainly central to this framework. If the tribulation is mainly for Israel, it makes a certain kind of sense within that view that the church wouldn't be there. What's the next big argument?
Maybe the most prominent one, the exemption from divine wrath.
Oh, okay.
The New Testament has these clear promises, like 1 Thessalonians 5.9, that believers are not appointed to suffer God's wrath. Pre-tribulationists argue pretty strongly that the judgments described throughout Revelation 6-18 during the tribulation, that is God's divine wrath poured out on sin and the world.
Makes sense.
So the core insight is, if believers are promised deliverance from that wrath, well, they can't be present during it. The source really highlights Revelation 3.10, the promise to the Philadelphia church.
I will keep you from the hour of trial.
Exactly. That is coming on the whole world. And they interpret that phrase, keep you from terioik in the Greek, as meaning total removal out of that specific time period, not just being protected through it.
Okay, so connecting the dots. Church isn't appointed to wrath. The tribulation is God's wrath. Therefore, the church must be gone beforehand. What's point number 3?
The imminence of Christ's coming. This is a really interesting one.
How so?
Well, pre-tribulationists argue their view is the only one that truly allows for the New Testament teaching that Christ could return at any moment, without any specific signs needing to happen first.
Right, the any moment return idea.
Exactly. Believers are told again and again to live expectantly, watching, waiting, like his return is at hand. Think Titus 2.13, James 5.8. Now, if the rapture happened after the very specific prophesied signs and events of the tribulation, well then, his coming wouldn't be truly imminent, would it? You'd know it couldn't happen until you saw those signs.
Yeah, you'd be ticking boxes.
Right, so the rapture, in this view, is that signless, imminent event that could just happen any second. The source even notes some early church fathers seem to express a similar hope for an imminent return, which they see as lining up with this pre-trib timing.
That's fascinating. The expectation itself becomes part of the argument. Okay, what about how the Bible actually describes his return?
Good question. They point to distinctions between rapture and second coming passages. The argument is, if you look closely at all the relevant scriptures, the Bible seems to describe Christ's return in two quite different ways.
Different ways, like how?
Well, the source argues these differences are best explained as two distinct events or phases. Some passages describe a sudden, almost secret meeting in the air for believers, taking them away to be with Christ. John 14.3, 1 Thessalonians 4.17 come to mind. But then other passages describe a very public, glorious return with believers, coming down to earth to judge and set up his kingdom, like Revelation 1.7, Zechariah 14, Revelation 19.
So secret versus public,
Yeah.
taking away versus returning with.
Exactly. The source lists contrasts like that. Secret versus open, removing believers versus coming to earth with believers. The purpose being deliverance and reward versus judgment and rule. And this two-stage coming, they argue, also helps answer some tricky logistical questions in other views, like who's left in natural bodies to populate the millennium if all believers are raptured and all unbelievers are judged at the very end in one single event.
Right. The practical mechanics of it all. Okay, and the final argument the source presents for the pre-tribulation view.
It's about the structure of the book of Revelation itself.
How does the structure argue for the timing?
Well, if you interpret Revelation futuristically, meaning chapters 4 onwards describe future events, then chapters 6 through 18 give this incredibly intense, detailed account of the 7-year tribulation, the judgments, the Antichrist, all of it. Now, the source points out something interesting. In this whole section, chapter 6 to 18, the word church ecclesia is basically missing.
Really? It's not there.
It appears a lot in chapters 1 to 3, the letters to the churches, and it pops up again right at the very end in chapter 22. But during the whole narrative of the tribulation judgments, silence. Now, saints suffering are mentioned, sure, but pre-tribulationists often see those as people converted during the tribulation after the church is gone. The corporate church isn't depicted on earth during that time. So for them, this structural absence is a powerful argument. It suggests the church isn't there, that it was removed before chapter 6 begins. Some even see John being called up to heaven in Revelation 4.1 as a kind of symbolic picture of the rapture itself.
Wow, that structural point is quite compelling from their perspective. Okay, so based on these 5 main arguments, the interpretive method and the Israel church distinction, the exemption from wrath, imminence, the 2 kinds of return passages, and Revelation's structure, the pre-tribulation view lays out a pretty clear sequence of events.
Yes, absolutely. The source maps out this timeline very clearly. It starts, obviously, with the present church age. This age concludes abruptly, imminently, with the rapture. That's the moment all true believers from this age are instantly caught up, meet Christ in the air, and are taken to be with him in heaven.
And then, immediately after the rapture, the 7-year tribulation period kicks off on earth.
Precisely. This period corresponds to Daniel's 70th week, that final 7 years on God's prophetic clock, primarily focused on Israel. It's described as a time of just unparalleled distress, Matthew 24.21. You have the rise of the Antichrist, these escalating global judgments, the seals, trumpets, bowls from Revelation, and intense persecution. But the source emphasizes, even though the church as a body is gone, God is still working. He raises up witnesses like the 144,000 Israelites mentioned in Revelation, and other converts too, though salvation during this time often comes at a terrible cost, usually martyrdom.
Right, so this period is definitely focused on God dealing with Israel and judging the unbelieving world, like the earlier arguments suggested. What happens at the dramatic end of the tribulation?
It all culminates in the Battle of Armageddon. The world's armies gather in northern Israel. Revelation 16 talks about this, often deceived by demonic forces. And at that climax, the glorious second coming of Christ happens. Jesus returns visibly, powerfully to earth with the armies of heaven, which, in this view, includes the raptured church, now glorified. Revelation 19 describes this.
And he defeats the Antichrist.
Utterly, the Antichrist and the false prophet are thrown immediately into the lake of fire, and their armies are destroyed. End of the battle.
Okay, so who's actually left on earth after all that?
Good question. The source explains that a surviving remnant of Israel will finally recognize Jesus as their Messiah. Zechariah 12 and Romans 11 touch on this. At the same time, any surviving Gentile believers go through what's often called the sheep and goats judgment from Matthew 25. The sheep are allowed to enter the next phase in their natural bodies.
So these survivors, Jews and Gentiles, in natural bodies, they populate the next era.
Exactly. They enter the millennium in their normal, unglorified bodies. And the sources also mention that tribulation martyrs and possibly Old Testament saints are resurrected at this point, getting glorified bodies and joining the already glorified church.
Which leads us straight into the next major phase, the millennial kingdom.
Yeah, a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. His headquarters will be in Jerusalem, according to Revelation 20. This is seen as fulfilling all those Old Testament prophecies about a future messianic age 2, Samuel 7, Isaiah 2, many others. This dispensational view really emphasizes the fulfillment of promises to Israel.
Like the throne of David restored.
Exactly. The throne of David restored, Israel exalted, Christ ruling directly over Israel and all the nations. And the church, already in glorified bodies, reigns with Christ over this earthly kingdom. Satan is bound during this whole 1,000 years, so you have unprecedented peace and righteousness. But importantly, human sin nature still exists in those people living in natural bodies. That remains a factor.
And this 1,000-year period ends with one last sort of surprising rebellion.
It does, yeah. Right at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is let loose for a short time. He manages to deceive the nations one last time and stirs up this final, futile revolt against Christ's rule. Revelation 20 describes it.
Does it last long?
Not at all. It's crushed instantly by fire from heaven, and then Satan is permanently cast into the lake of fire, joining the Antichrist and the false prophet. Game over for him.
And that brings us, finally, to the ultimate end state.
The new heaven and new earth. Revelation 21, this is the eternal order, a completely renewed, transformed creation. No more sin, no suffering, no death. God dwells directly with his redeemed people, all believers from all ages finally united. And really, this hope for a new creation is shared across Orthodox Christianity, even if the path to get there looks different in the various theological frameworks.
So pulling back from this deep dive, wow, we've covered a lot of ground. We looked at several end times timing theories, from the sources post-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath, even that partial rapture idea. And then we really zoomed in on the detailed, structured case the main source makes for the pre-tribulation rapture.
Exactly. The source presents the pre-trib view as this cohesive system. It argues it provides a consistent understanding, especially if you start from that evangelical, dispensational, theological framework. It suggests this view best honors the distinct plans God seems to have for Israel and the church. And it's supported by those arguments we discussed: deliverance from wrath, the church's absence in Revelation's tribulation parts, the doctrine of imminence, the different descriptions of Christ's return, and the very structure of Revelation itself.
Yeah, and the sources acknowledge, right, that there's no single verse that just says, that the rapture is before the tribulation, explicitly like that.
Correct. No single verse.
But the argument presented is that the cumulative weight of all these different lines of biblical evidence, when you interpret them from this specific literal dispensational perspective, makes pre-tribulationism the most, coherent and plausible scenario for those who hold that framework.
And it is really important, as the source itself notes, to approach all these topics with humility. While Christians hold different views on the exact timing and sequence, there's broad agreement on the really big things, the core truths. Jesus is coming again in glory. There will be a resurrection and judgment. God will establish his eternal kingdom. The pre-tribulation theory is just presented here as one significant way of putting all the scriptural pieces together, aiming to paint a picture that honors the literal promises and really emphasizes that blessed hope of Christ's imminent return and deliverance for the church.
Well, that was definitely a thorough deep dive into some pretty complex material. Thanks for bringing these fascinating sources to the table. Understanding the different ways people interpret prophecy and the specific arguments they use to get there is incredibly valuable, isn't it?
It really is.
It helps you see the different pieces of the puzzle and how they might fit together differently depending on your starting assumptions about Scripture.
Absolutely. Seeing how concepts like literal interpretation, or that distinction between Israel and the church, or promises about wrath, seeing how they're all woven together to build a whole timeline, it really illuminates these discussions. It's a rich area.
It really is. And it leaves you with a lot to think about. So for you, our listener, maybe here's a provocative thought to mull over, kind of stemming from that argument for imminence in the pre-trib view we discussed. If the idea that Christ could return at any moment is a key biblical concept, as argued here, how might genuinely living with that expectation, how might that practically impact your daily life, your priorities, the way you view the future? Just something to consider long after this deep dive in.
That's a profoundly important question indeed.
And that's all the time we have for this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and maybe helpful in navigating these different end times perspectives.